Okay, just imagine this for a second. Your country is being bombed, day in and day out. What do you even do? Well, in 1989, the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia did something pretty much unthinkable. It took the bombers to court. Let's dive into the absolutely wild story of when a nation, in the middle of a war, sued NATO at the world's highest court. So, the year is 1999. The conflict in Kosovo is at its peak, and in response, NATO launches this massive bombing campaign against the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. But then, on April 29th, while all this is happening, Yugoslavia files these explosive lawsuits at the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, against 10 NATO member states. We're talking Germany, the UK, France, the heavy hitters. So what was Yugoslavia actually accusing these global powers of? Well, these weren't just some minor diplomatic complaints. No. These were some of the most serious allegations that one country can possibly make against another.
I mean, the sheer scope of these accusations is just staggering. Yugoslavia argued the bombing campaign was an illegal use of force, a total violation of its sovereignty, and a complete failure to protect civilians. But then they took it even further. They alleged the use of prohibited weapons, and here's the big one. They alleged that the attacks amounted to genocide, a deliberate attempt to destroy the Yugoslav national group. That is a massive charge.
Now, with bombs still falling, Yugoslavia's first priority wasn't some long, drawn-out trial. They just wanted the bombing to stop. And that led to the very first major legal showdown at the court, right in the middle of everything, in 1999. So the urgent question for everyone was this. Could the ICJ basically issue an emergency order to halt NATO's entire military operation while the case was being decided? The legal tool they were trying to use is called provisional measures. Really, you can just think of it as the international law version of a temporary restraining order. Yugoslavia was basically begging the court to step in right away to prevent any more harm. But to get those measures, they had to convince the court that they had at least a prima facie case, that, on first glance, the court probably had the authority to hear the case in the first place.
And this really gets us to the heart of the 1999 argument. See, Yugoslavia based its whole claim for jurisdiction on the Genocide Convention. They argued the bombing campaign showed an intent to destroy their people. But the court, at this early stage, looked at it and said, while the use of force here raises some very serious issues of international law, it doesn't really seem to have that specific intent required for the crime of genocide. And you have to understand the bar for proving genocidal intent is incredibly high.
And so, the court rejected the request for those emergency provisional measures. The bombing campaign went on until June of 1999. But, and this is super important, the case itself wasn't over, not by a long shot. The main event, the bigger question of whether the court could even hear the case at all, was still to come. Right, so fast forward 5 years to 2004. The court is finally ready to deliver its judgment on whether it could hear the case. And the answer came as a total shock, and it all hinged on this fundamental question of identity.
Okay, before we get to the ruling, we need a quick detour on how the World Court actually works. Because you can't just walk in off the street. To bring a case, you have to be a state and you have to be a party to the court's statute. And for pretty much every country on Earth, that just means you have to be a member of the United Nations. So this whole massive case boiled down to one single defining question. Was Yugoslavia actually a UN member when it filed that lawsuit?
This timeline right here gets to the heart of the legal chaos of the 90s. So after the old socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia broke up in 92, the new Federal Republic of Yugoslavia claimed it was the same state, just smaller, and tried to just keep the old UN membership. But the UN said, whoa, not so fast, and passed resolutions saying it had to reapply like everyone else. For 8 years, you had this totally bizarre, ambiguous situation where Yugoslavia insisted it was a member and the UN said it wasn't. It all finally got sorted in 2000 when it did apply and was admitted as a brand new member. So, back to our big question. Was Yugoslavia a UN member back in April 1999? The court's stunning answer, looking back on all that chaos from 2004, was no. The court described Yugoslavia's status during that weird period as sui generis. It's a Latin term that basically means of its own kind or in a class by itself. It wasn't suspended, it wasn't kicked out, but it wasn't a full member either. And in the court's final decision, this unique, kind of fuzzy status just wasn't enough. It meant that in 1999, Yugoslavia simply did not have access to the court. So, case dismissed. But the story doesn't end there.
Because the way the judges got to this decision, well, it revealed a pretty deep fracture inside the court itself. On the surface, the verdict looks crystal clear. The vote to find that the court had no jurisdiction was 15-0. Unanimous. End of story, right? So, if every single judge agreed on the outcome, where's the controversy? Well, as it turns out, agreeing on what to do is a very, very different thing from agreeing on why you're doing it. And here's the real story behind that 15-0 vote. While all 15 judges did vote to dismiss the case, a group of 7 judges, that's almost half the court, they filed a joint declaration saying they'd profoundly disagreed with the reasoning the majority used to get there. And they did not mince words. These 7 judges basically argued that the court's new ruling on Yugoslavia's UN status contradicted its own previous decisions. They said the court could have, and probably should have, dismissed the case on other, much more solid legal grounds, the same ones it kind of hinted at way back in 1999. So what's the big takeaway from this incredibly complex legal drama? It actually reveals something really fundamental about the power and the limits of international law. Ultimately, what this case shows us is that the World Court isn't some kind of global supercop. Its entire authority is built on the consent of nations. And this case is a stark reminder that before the court can ever rule on the substance of a dispute, on the big questions of war and peace and justice, it first has to get through this minefield of procedural rules about who is even allowed in the courthouse door. But this quote really gets to the heart of the court's final message. In its judgment, the court included this powerful reminder. It was essentially saying, look, just because we can't hear this case on a technicality doesn't mean the underlying actions were legal. It was a declaration that jurisdiction might be a technical question, but responsibility under international law is an absolute. Which leaves us with this final thought. You've got a nation on trial, a court completely divided on its reasoning, and a case thrown out not because of what happened, but because of a question of membership. It really forces us to ask, if the world's highest court can be stopped dead in its tracks by a procedural technicality during a time of war, what does that truly tell us about both the incredible promise and the frustrating limits of international justice?